I never believed in ghosts, monsters, or things that go bump in the night. That changed 3 months ago when I inherited my grandfather's house in Millfield, a small town buried deep in the mountains of West Virginia. What I thought would be a fresh start has become a nightly dance with something that defies explanation. I'm sharing this story because I need someone to understand what I have learned, and more importantly, someone who might be willing to take my place. My name is Daniel Pierce. I'm 28 years old, and until recently, I lived a perfectly normal life in Baltimore, working as a graphic designer. When my grandfather passed away unexpectedly in his sleep, I inherited his property, a modest 2-story house sitting on 5 acres at the edge of Millfield. The house itself was built in 1952. Nothing particularly special about it, except for its isolation. Woods surround the property on 3 sides, with only a narrow gravel road connecting it to the main town. The inheritance came at a perfect time. My company had just switched to fully remote work. My lease was ending, and city life had begun to feel suffocating. A quiet house in the mountains seemed like exactly what I needed to reset my life and focus on my freelance work. The town had fewer than 800 residents, but it had reliable internet and a peaceful atmosphere that appealed to me immediately. I moved in on a Tuesday in late June. The house was clean and well maintained, though it felt frozen in time. My grandfather had lived there alone for over 30 years, and his presence lingered in every room. Family photos covered the mantel. His reading glasses still sat on the kitchen table, and his coffee cup remained in the sink, as if he'd just finished his morning routine. The first 2 nights passed without incident. I spent my days unpacking, setting up my home office, and exploring the property. The woods were beautiful, dense with oak and pine trees that blocked most of the sunlight, even during the day. I found old trails that seemed to lead deeper into the forest, though I never followed them far. Something about those woods felt unwelcoming, as if I was intruding on space that wasn't meant for human visitors. On the 3rd night, everything changed. I had stayed up late organizing my grandfather's books when exhaustion finally overtook me around 2:30. I climbed into bed, turned off the lights, and settled in for what I expected to be another peaceful night's sleep. That's when I heard it for the first time. At exactly 3:03, a sound unlike anything I'd ever experienced shattered the silence. It was a scream, but not human, not animal either. It was something between the two, a sound that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. The pitch was wrong, too high and too low at the same time, creating harmonics that made my vision blur and my teeth ache. The sound was moving. It started somewhere deep in the woods to my left, traveled along the road in front of my house, and disappeared into the forest on the other side. The entire episode lasted maybe 15 seconds, but it felt like hours. When silence returned, I lay in bed with my heart hammering against my ribs, trying to convince myself I had dreamed it. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I drove into town to ask about the noise. Millfield's main street consisted of a grocery store, a gas station, a small diner, and a handful of other businesses that looked like they hadn't changed since the 1980s. I stopped at Morrison's Grocery, hoping the staff might know about local wildlife or maybe construction work that could explain what I'd heard. The young woman at the register, who couldn't have been older than 20, looked at me blankly when I described the sound. "I've lived here my whole life," she said, "and I've never heard anything like that. You sure you weren't dreaming?" Her confusion seemed genuine, which made me doubt my own experience. Maybe the stress of moving, combined with the unfamiliar environment, had caused some kind of auditory hallucination. I decided to let it go and focus on settling into my new life. But that night, at 3:03, it happened again. This time, I was ready for it, lying awake and checking the clock every few minutes after 3. The scream came right on schedule, following the exact same path as the night before. Same inhuman quality, same bone-deep resonance, same 15-second duration. There was no mistaking it for a dream or hallucination. Something was out there, and it followed a precise routine. The next day, I decided to search my grandfather's belongings more thoroughly. Maybe he had left some explanation for the nightly visitor. I started with his bedroom, going through dresser drawers and checking closets, but found nothing unusual. The living room and kitchen yielded similar results. It wasn't until I reached his study that I discovered the first clue. The study was my grandfather's sanctuary, lined with bookshelves and dominated by an old oak desk that had seen decades of use. I was cleaning out the desk drawers when I found a folded piece of paper tucked inside an old leather-bound Bible. The paper was yellowed with age, and my grandfather's handwriting covered both sides in his distinctive, shaky script. At the top of the page, written in capital letters, were the words, "Rules for 303. Below that, a numbered list. Never look directly out any window at 3:03. Keep all curtains and blinds closed from 3 to 3:10. Do not turn on any lights during this time. If you hear scratching at the door, do not answer. Keep a bowl of salt water by the front door. Replace weekly. Never go outside between 3 and 3:10. At the bottom of the page, my grandfather had written, "Danny, if you're reading this, it means you're living in the house now. Follow these rules exactly. Your life depends on it. The thing that walks past every night is not something you want to meet. Love, Grandpa Joe." My first instinct was to dismiss the note as the product of an aging mind. My grandfather had been in his 80s when he died, and while he'd seemed sharp during our last phone conversation, people can hide cognitive decline well. The rules seemed like superstitious nonsense, the kind of thing someone might invent to cope with an unexplained phenomenon. But something about the specificity of the instructions gave me pause. The timing matched exactly with what I'd experienced. And there was something about my grandfather's handwriting. It wasn't the shaky scrawl of confusion, but deliberate, careful lettering that suggested complete lucidity. That night, I decided to follow the rules, if only to honor my grandfather's memory. I closed all the curtains and blinds at 3 o'clock, turned off every light in the house, and found a ceramic bowl in the kitchen that I filled with salt water and placed by the front door. Then I sat in the dark living room and waited. At 3:03, the scream came as expected, but this time, instead of the terrifying unknown I'd experienced the previous nights, there was something almost routine about it. The sound still made my bones ache, but following the rules created a sense of protection, like I was safely observing something dangerous from behind bulletproof glass. For the next week, I followed the rules religiously. Every night, the same routine. Close curtains at 3, turn off lights, wait in darkness until 3:10. The screaming came every single night at exactly 3:03, never varying in time or duration. I began to feel foolish about the elaborate precautions, but I maintained them anyway. On the 8th night, my curiosity finally got the better of me. I had been sitting in darkness for about 5 minutes when I noticed how quiet the house was. No creaking floorboards, no settling sounds, just absolute silence, broken only by the distant hum of the refrigerator. The routine had become so familiar that I felt confident making a small test. At 3:05, 2 minutes after the nightly scream had passed, I turned on a small table lamp in the living room. Nothing happened. No sudden sounds, no sense of immediate danger, nothing to suggest I had violated some cosmic rule. I felt vindicated in my skepticism about my grandfather's instructions. But the next night, something changed. The scream came at 3:03 as always, but instead of passing by the house in its usual 15-second transit, it stopped. For 30 long seconds, the horrible sound held position directly in front of my house before finally continuing its journey into the far woods. I sat in the darkness with my heart racing, wondering if my small rule violation the previous night had somehow triggered this change in behavior. The following night, I decided to push the boundary a little further. Instead of keeping all curtains closed, I opened one in the living room. Just a crack, maybe 2 inches of gap that would let me see outside while still maintaining most of the concealment my grandfather had insisted upon. At 3:03, as the scream began its approach, I positioned myself next to the window and peered out through the small opening. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. Moving along the road in front of my house was something that my mind struggled to process. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its torso and joints that bent in directions that defied human anatomy. Its movement was wrong, not the natural gait of any animal I'd ever seen, but a flowing, undulating motion that suggested bones and muscles that worked according to different rules than earthly biology. I couldn't make out fine details in the darkness, but the general shape was humanoid enough to be recognizable while being alien enough to trigger every evolutionary alarm in my brain. This was something that should not exist, something that violated the natural order so fundamentally that my vision actually blurred as I looked at it. The worst part was its head. Where a face should have been, there was only darkness, not shadow, not absence of light, but a void that seemed to absorb illumination. Yet despite the lack of visible features, I had the absolute certainty that it was aware of me. It knew I was watching. The scream that came from that void wasn't just sound. It was communication. It was acknowledgement. It knew I had broken the rules. After that night, I became obsessed with understanding what I was dealing with. I searched every inch of my grandfather's house, looking for more information, more rules, anything that might explain the creature that visited every night at 3:03. I found more than I bargained for. Carved into a wooden beam in the basement was another rule. If the screaming stops in front of your house, count to 60 before breathing. Written in pencil on the inside wall of the bedroom closet, never say its name aloud. Etched into the concrete floor of the basement. If you see footprints in your yard, sprinkle salt on them before sunrise. The more I searched, the more rules I discovered. Some were written on scraps of paper and hidden in books. Others were carved into wooden surfaces or written on walls in places where you'd only see them if you were specifically looking. My grandfather had spent decades documenting his interactions with this entity, building a complex system of behaviors designed to maintain some kind of balance. The extended list I eventually compiled included: if the screaming stops in front of your house, count to 60 before breathing. Never say its name aloud, though no name was provided. If you see footprints in your yard, Sprinkle salt on them before sunrise. The thing cannot cross running water. Keep the old well pump running. If it knocks 3 times, pretend to be asleep until sunrise. Never follow it into the woods. I also found a journal hidden in the back of my grandfather's bedroom closet. The entries spanned 15 years, documenting changes in the entity's behavior, modifications to the rules, and interactions with other residents who dealt with similar phenomena. According to his notes, there were 7 properties in the region that hosted these entities, each following slightly different protocols, but all part of some larger pattern. The journal revealed that my grandfather hadn't discovered the rules through trial and error. He had inherited them from the previous owner, just as I was inheriting them from him. The house came with responsibilities that went beyond paying property taxes and maintaining the structure. Armed with this new information, I tried to adjust my routine to incorporate all the rules I'd discovered. I kept the old well pump running constantly, replaced the salt water bowl weekly, and maintained absolute darkness during the 3 to 3:10 window. For several weeks, the system seemed to work perfectly. The entity continued its nightly visits, but they remained predictable and manageable. Then I made a critical mistake. I had been working late on a freelance project, trying to meet a deadline that had been moved up unexpectedly. The work was complex, requiring hours of detailed attention, and I lost track of time. I fell asleep at my computer sometime after 2:30, exhausted from the long day. I woke up at 3:04. My computer monitor was still on, casting blue light throughout the room. One of the curtains had fallen partially open when I'd knocked against it while sleeping. Every rule I'd learned to follow religiously had been violated simultaneously. I was sitting in a lit room, clearly visible through an open window 1 minute after the entity should have passed by. But it hadn't passed by. It was standing in my front yard, perfectly motionless, facing my house. Through the gap in the curtain, I could see it clearly for the first time. The details I had missed during my previous brief glimpse were now horribly apparent. Its skin was grey-black, like old leather left to rot in the sun. Its limbs were indeed too long, with extra joints that allowed them to fold in ways that hurt to look at. Its hands ended in fingers that extended at least 8 inches, tipped with what looked like yellowed bone. But it was the face that nearly broke my sanity. Where features should have been was a gaping void, as if someone had cut a hole in reality itself. No eyes, no nose, just an empty space that seemed to extend infinitely inward. Below that void was a mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth that extended down what should have been its throat. The teeth were different sizes and shapes, as if they had been collected from dozens of different animals and crammed together without regard for function. We looked at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, without warning, it opened that terrible mouth even wider and released a sound that was nothing like the screams I had grown accustomed to. This was a voice, clearly attempting human speech, but filtered through anatomy that was never meant for language. "I see you," it said, and every window in my house rattled. After that encounter, everything changed. The entity's visits became less predictable. Sometimes it arrived early at 3:01 or even 3:00. Sometimes it stayed late, maintaining its position in front of my house until 3:15 or 3:20. The screaming became more varied too, sometimes angry, sometimes almost conversational, and occasionally mimicking sounds I recognized. My grandfather's voice, my own voice, conversations I'd had on the phone. I started finding evidence of its presence during daylight hours. Footprints appeared around my house, not human, but not quite animal either. Long depressions in the soil that suggested those extended fingers I'd seen. My car bore scratches that looked deliberate, arranged in patterns that almost resembled letters or symbols. One morning, I discovered a dead deer in my backyard, arranged in a way that defied natural death. Its limbs had been positioned to form shapes that hurt to look at directly, and its eyes had been removed with surgical precision. I buried it immediately, but the next morning, there were more footprints around the burial site. I was losing control of the situation, and I knew I needed help. Fortunately, help found me. Robert McCarthy lived in the closest house to mine, about a quarter mile through the woods. I'd seen him occasionally during my trips to town, but had never spoken to him beyond polite nods. He was probably in his 70s, retired, and kept to himself most of the time. One afternoon, as I was checking my mailbox, I saw him walking up my driveway. He moved with the careful gait of someone who had learned to be quiet in the woods, and his expression was serious in a way that immediately put me on alert. "You've been having trouble with the rules," he said, without preamble. It wasn't a question. I stared at him, trying to determine how much he knew and whether I could trust him. "What rules?" Robert smiled grimly. "The ones your grandfather left you. The ones you've been breaking. That thing has been staying longer at your place, making more noise. It's affecting the whole area." The relief I felt at finding someone else who understood the situation was overwhelming. I invited Robert into my house, and over coffee, he told me his story. Robert had been dealing with his own entity for 12 years. His property, like mine, sat at the edge of the old growth forest, and like mine, it hosted a nightly visitor. His entity wasn't identical to mine. It didn't scream, for one thing, but it followed similar patterns and required similar management. "These things," he explained, "they're not ghosts or demons or anything from folklore. They're something else entirely. They exist in the spaces between our understanding of reality, and they feed on fear and attention. The rules aren't really about protection. They're about maintaining a balance that keeps them satisfied without giving them enough power to do worse things." Robert told me about the previous family who had lived in my house before my grandfather, the Johnsons. They had moved in during the early 1990s, a young couple with 2 small children. Unlike my grandfather, they had no knowledge of the entity or the rules required to manage it. "They tried to fight it," Robert said, "called the police, tried to record it, even attempted to follow it into the woods one night. That was a mistake. 3 weeks after they moved in, neighbors found their house empty. No sign of struggle, no indication of where they'd gone. Just an empty house with dinner still on the table and car keys still hanging by the door. The Johnson family was never found. Their car remained in the driveway until the bank eventually repossessed the property and sold it to my grandfather, who had come to the area specifically because he understood what needed to be done." Robert explained that there was an informal network of people who dealt with these entities. 7 houses in the region hosted them, each following slightly different protocols based on the specific characteristics of their visitor. When one house failed to maintain proper management, the pressure increased on all the others. "Your grandfather was the anchor point," Robert told me. "His entity was the strongest, but he was also the most experienced at managing it. With him gone and you still learning, the whole system is becoming unstable. That explained why my entity's behavior had become more erratic. It wasn't just reacting to my rule violations. It was responding to the absence of my grandfather's expert management. Robert helped me understand which rules were still relevant and which had become outdated as the entity evolved. Many of the rules I'd found were decoys or applied to previous behavioral patterns. The entity learned and adapted, requiring constant adjustment to the management protocols. Working together, we developed a new set of rules based on the entity's current behavior. Updated rules. Never acknowledge it exists when speaking to others who can't see it. Maintain the illusion of normalcy during daylight hours. Keep one window slightly cracked during its visits to prevent it from trying to get in. Replace the salt water bowl with blessed water monthly. If it speaks in a human voice, respond only with, "I understand," and nothing more. Never try to photograph or record it. If you must move away, you must find someone to take your place. The most important rule Robert emphasized was the last one. These entities were bound to specific locations, but they required human acknowledgement to maintain their existence. Abandoning the property wouldn't make the entity disappear. It would make it angry and desperate, likely leading it to expand its territory or intensify its efforts to attract attention. "You can't run from this," Robert told me. "Your grandfather understood that. He spent 30 years keeping that thing satisfied so it wouldn't become everyone else's problem. Now that responsibility belongs to you." I spent the following weeks implementing the new protocols and studying the entity's behavior more carefully. Robert visited regularly to check on my progress and share information from the other houses in the network. Gradually, I began to achieve the same kind of stable routine my grandfather had maintained. The entity still visited every night at 3:03, but its behavior became predictable again. I learned to read its moods based on subtle variations in its approach and the quality of its vocalizations. Some nights it seemed almost content, passing by quickly with what I came to think of as its normal scream. Other nights it was agitated, staying longer and making sounds that suggested frustration or hunger. I developed my own additions to the rule set based on what I observed. If it knocks, count the knocks and knock back the same number -1. If it speaks your name, respond, "Not tonight," and nothing else. Keep a journal of any changes in behavior, but never read previous entries. If you must leave town for more than 3 days, arrange for someone to maintain the routine. The entity will test new people. Stick to the rules no matter what. If the screaming ever stops permanently, leave immediately and warn the others. The system worked. For 2 months, I maintained a stable relationship with my nightly visitor. I learned to see our interaction not as a supernatural threat, but as a peculiar form of symbiosis. I provided acknowledgement and routine. It provided predictability and containment. I began to understand why my grandfather had never moved away despite having every opportunity to do so. There was something oddly comforting about the routine, knowing that every night at 3:03, something would pass by my house and scream, and I would be ready for it. In a world full of uncertainty and chaos, this was one thing I could count on. But nothing lasts forever. Last month, I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave me 6 to 8 months, maybe a year, with aggressive treatment. I've decided against the treatment. I've seen what it does to people, and I'd rather have a few good months than a year of misery. This creates a problem. The entity needs a caretaker, someone who understands the rules and will maintain the routine. I can't simply abandon the house and hope for the best. I can't sell it to unsuspecting buyers and hope they figure out the situation before something terrible happens. I need to find someone who can take my place, someone who understands what they're signing up for and is willing to accept the responsibility. That's why I'm sharing this story. I need someone to inherit not just my grandfather's house, but his role as guardian of something that defies explanation. The house is paid off, the property taxes are minimal, and the location is perfect for someone who works remotely or doesn't need to commute. All I ask is that you follow the rules and maintain the routine. The entity isn't evil exactly. It's not trying to hurt anyone. It simply exists and requires acknowledgement. Think of it as having a very unusual neighbor, one with specific needs that must be met to maintain peaceful coexistence. Follow the rules, respect its routine, and you'll find that life here is actually quite peaceful. But if you're not completely committed to this responsibility, please don't respond. The Johnson family thought they could handle it, and they disappeared without a trace. My grandfather spent 30 years perfecting a system of management that kept everyone safe. I've continued his work for 3 months and learned firsthand how quickly things can go wrong when the rules are broken. I have maybe 4 months left before I'm no longer capable of maintaining the routine. If you think you might be interested in taking over, contact me as soon as possible. I'll need time to teach you everything I've learned, to introduce you to the other members of our informal network, and to help you develop your own understanding of the entity's patterns and preferences. Time is running short. Last night, the entity arrived 2 minutes early, and its screaming sounded different. Not angry or frustrated, but almost eager. I think it somehow knows about my illness and my plans to find a replacement. It's looking forward to training someone new. If you're reading this and thinking it might be an interesting adventure, let me be clear. This isn't a horror movie where everything works out in the end. This is a permanent commitment to something that most people would consider a living nightmare. You'll spend every night for the rest of your life preparing for 303, following rules that seem arbitrary but are actually matters of life and death, managing a relationship with something that exists outside normal reality. But if you're someone who feels disconnected from the world, someone looking for purpose and routine, someone who doesn't mind solitude and finds comfort in ritual, this might be exactly what you're looking for. I'll be waiting. The house is at 1847 Pine Ridge Road in Millfield, West Virginia. If you're interested, come by during daylight hours. We have a lot to discuss and not much time to do it. Just remember, once you commit to this, there's no going back. The entity will be your responsibility for the rest of your life. But in exchange, you'll have a home, a purpose, and the strange comfort of knowing that every night at 3:03, something walks screaming past your house, and you'll be ready for it. I'm posting this update because something has changed, and anyone considering my offer needs to know about it. 3 nights ago, the entity didn't come at 3:03. For the first time in over 30 years, according to my grandfather's records, it missed its scheduled visit. I followed all the rules anyway, sitting in darkness and waiting until 3:10, but the night remained silent. The next night, the same thing happened. No scream, no presence, just silence. Last night, I was sitting in the dark at 3 o'clock. wondering if the entity had somehow moved on or disappeared, when I heard something I'd never heard before. Footsteps on my front porch. 3 deliberate knocks on my front door. According to the rules, when it knocks 3 times, you pretend to be asleep until sunrise. I followed that rule perfectly, remaining motionless and silent, despite every instinct screaming at me to respond. But then I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. It spoke in my grandfather's voice, perfect in every detail. "Danny, it's time to let me in. I've been teaching it how to knock." I maintained the rule, staying silent until dawn. But I understand now what's happening. The entity is evolving. It's learning new behaviors, and it knows I'm dying. It's preparing for the transition to new management, and it's getting impatient. If anyone is still considering my offer, you need to come soon. I don't think I have as much time as I originally thought. And when you do come, bring Robert with you. His number is 304-5557-842. You're going to need all the help you can get. The rules are changing, and I'm afraid I might not live long enough to figure out what the new ones are. Come quickly.